We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 13 today. And before we get into that, we're going to do a quick little summary of what we covered before. So quick summary, we start with the background of Proverbs. So as before, you've heard this many times, but repetition helps. So as before, Proverbs has multiple authors and it has some editors to the whole collection. Now, this is not some kind of speculative imagination gone wild kind of thing where we're guessing about all of this. But no, you read through Proverbs and you'll see little sections here and there. You'll see these titles. For example, in Proverbs 1:1, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David. That's a pretty good example. So we know that Solomon wrote this part, and Solomon wrote most of Proverbs, from chapter 1 all the way up to chapter 24, however you want to divide that up. And later on, in chapter 25, we see in verse 1, these also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. So these are the copyists. They transcribed some of Solomon's Proverbs in this section, starting at Proverbs chapter 25. And many scholars, and myself, I'm not a scholar, but myself included, would consider the editors of Proverbs to be the men of Hezekiah. So Solomon, he reigned a couple hundred years before Hezekiah. So if Hezekiah's men were the last editors of Proverbs, and we don't have any reason to think otherwise, really, then we can date Proverbs at around 700 BC, where, Hezekiah was reigning, and he had men doing this stuff. So that's Proverbs chapter 25, and later on, Proverbs chapter 30, you have the words of Agur, son of Jakeh, the oracle, and you have Proverbs chapter 31, verse 1, the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. So you have these different people, and they're included in the collection of Proverbs. And the question came up, okay, if we have all these different people involved in Proverbs, and we don't know who Agur is, who's that guy? Who's King Lemuel? We don't really know who those people are. We don't really know who men of Hezekiah are exactly and specifically. We do know about Hezekiah, but what about his men? So the question came up with, okay, why should we include this in Holy Scripture as canonical in the Old Testament? Now the simple answer is, and we went into more detail with this earlier, is that Jesus affirmed the category of the writings which Proverbs is a part of. So in the Hebrew Bible in the early 1st century and onwards, there were three major categories. You had the law, first 5 books, Moses' law. You had the prophets, think Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all of those minor prophets as well, Zephaniah, Zechariah, and so on. And you also had the writings category. Psalms was the biggest part of the writings, and if you just said Psalms, you could also be likely referring to the writings in general. So Psalms was the primary part of the writings category, and Proverbs was also an integral part of that in the 1st century. So Jesus affirmed all three of those categories. He also quoted from those categories, and so he affirmed the whole. And that is why we include Proverbs in here. So Jesus affirmed Proverbs, so we should affirm Proverbs as well. Quite simple. Now getting on, Proverbs chapters 1 to 9. This is the words of Solomon in fatherly discourse kind of style. So you'll see a lot of, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Listen, my son. And hear me, my son," and so on and so forth, where Solomon takes this fatherly role as he instructs his audience about wisdom. And starting in chapter 1, we have 1 to 7 as the introduction. This gives you the purpose of Proverbs as well, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction, to give prudence to the simple. That tells you a little bit about the audience in verse 4, to give prudence to the simple. Knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning. So that gives us some insight into who this is written for. And verse 7 gives us the whole motto of the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Great verse to memorize too, if you haven't already. So in Proverbs 1-9, there are a couple of themes. Number one, wisdom, of course. And also, you hear wisdom personified. It starts in chapter 1, verse 20. Wisdom cries aloud in the street. So wisdom is being personified. She's raising her voice. She's doing these things, calling people to listen to her and not to folly. Chapter 2, we have the value of wisdom. Chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Chapter 4, we get more into the father's instruction, where Solomon's taking that fatherly role. And in chapter 5, he's warning us about the adulteress. He'll do that again in chapter 6 as well, and warning us about being a sluggard and being lazy, where destruction comes. Chapter 7 is more about the adulteress, and chapter 8 is the big passage on personified wisdom. And some people take this chapter to be referring to the Son of God. I personally don't, but it's definitely an option. So they look at a passage in Corinthians which says that Christ is the power and wisdom of God, and then they take a look at some of the verses in Proverbs chapter 8, namely verses 22 to 31, where it says, 25, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he made firm the skies above, established the fountains of the deep. And so, wisdom, whoever or whatever that is, verse 30, I was beside him, like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. You know, that does sound a little bit like the Son of God, the Logos, who was with God and involved in creation, pre-existent. So, you know, it kind of sounds like that a little bit. But I think there are some difficulties to that interpretation, and we looked at some of those difficulties in our Proverbs 8 study. We won't mention them all right now, but those are two options that way you can interpret that. Either we're talking about an attribute or abstract concept of wisdom that God has, or some kind of virtue perhaps, or we're talking about the Son of God, who is God's wisdom. Those are the two options. Chapter 9, you have more personification of wisdom. Wisdom has built her house, hewn her 7 pillars, and she's prepared a feast, essentially. And later in that pretty much last part of that chapter, you have the woman of folly, who's also preparing a feast. And both of them are inviting the simple. They're inviting the people out on the streets. Oh, come feast with wisdom. And folly says, no, come feast with folly. And so we get that invitation as well. Are you going to feast with the woman of wisdom, or will you feast with the woman of folly? Chapter 10, we get another title, perhaps even a subtitle. Verse 1 says, the Proverbs of Solomon. So you remember in verse 1 of chapter 1, we also got the Proverbs of Solomon, introducing that section. Now we get another very similar introduction here. And the difference, though, is that chapters 10 to 22, 24 are short, pithy sayings. These are more of what we would think of when we think of as Proverbs. But chapters 1 to 9 are also Proverbs. They're just longer form discourse kind of stuff. And they're a lot easier to categorize. But chapters 10 to 22 and 24 are much more difficult. Namely, the main theme that we've been working with from chapters 10 to 12, which we hit last week, is righteousness versus wickedness. What does the righteous person do? What does the wicked person do? And what does righteousness look like? What does wickedness look like? And how do they compare and contrast with each other? And what part does the wise person have in all of this? And what part does the foolish person have in all of this? And today we're getting into Proverbs chapter 13. Any questions on the summary? Quick questions. Nothing too crazy. Any questions?
Not that comes to mind for me. I mean, seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Hopefully the repetition is kind of helping you guys structure Proverbs, because it is difficult. So just remember, chapters 1 to 9 is the fatherly instruction. Chapters 10 to 22 or to 24, depending on how you want to divide that up. We'll look into that later. That's the short, pithy sayings. Still Solomon. So he wrote most of Proverbs. Very easily, we can say that Solomon wrote most of Proverbs. So as we get into chapter 13, we're going to start with something a little different now. This is going to help us greatly organize Proverbs, because you may have been having trouble before reading through a section, not really understanding it because it seems so scattered and random and disorganized. Here's one saying, oh, here's another little saying. Next verse, here's a different saying. So we're going to look at some things to help us organize all of this. So just bear with me. This is going to be a little difficult, a little confusing to some of you, but it will make so much more sense at the end as we start applying these concepts. So let's begin. So let's look at some patterns of wisdom literature. We're talking about patterns. That's the label that our commentary gives them. This is Dwayne Garrett. He's our commentator. And there are a number of different patterns. So the first pattern is the simplest pattern. We have the monocolon. And a colon is just a single line. When you're talking about wisdom literature, or you're talking about Hebrew poetry, a colon is just one line. And most translations do pretty well in showing you these different lines. So if you look at the ESV or the NASB or some other translation, you'll see, if we're looking at verse 1 of chapter 13, a wise son hears his father's instruction. That's all on one line. And that would be considered a colon. And then the next line after that, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. That's a second line. So that's what a colon is. And the plural of colon is cola. So let me just write that down there. Colon, cola. Colon is just spelled like the English 2 dots grammatical thing, the punctuation. And cola might remind you of Coca-Cola too much. Well, that's what it is. So that's a colon. It's just one line. And if that one line stands by itself completely, there's nothing else around it, that's called a monocolon. Mono, just one. So here's an example of that. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 26. That's a monocolon. Whoever gives an honest answer kisses the lips. One single line, nothing else around it. Pretty simple. And a bicolon is the next one we'll look at. So we're just building up, going up numerically. A bicolon, you could also call it a couplet if you're familiar with poetry. So a couplet is 2 lines that kind of work together, kind of go together very simply, very well. And chapter 13 starts with a bicolon. A wise son hears his father's instruction. Sometimes the translation will help you here with the punctuation. You have a comma there instead of a period ending that little section. But a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. That tells you that we're looking at a bicolon here. And in the Hebrew, you'll also see that sometimes fairly easily, it's more easy to see the whole section. And they usually end where these verses end. So that's pretty easy. So that's a bicolon. You have 2 lines that kind of go together and very strongly go together. Next you have a tricolon, which you probably could have guessed. So you have a tricolon, 3 lines. After that, you don't have a quadcolon, you have a quatrain is what they call them. A quatrain is 4 lines. After that you have a pentad, 5 lines. You could have a hexad after that, 6 lines. And sometimes you have even larger units after that, which are more difficult to categorize. So that's pretty much it. Monocolons, bicolons, tricolons, quatrains, and pentads. You don't really need to know the last couple of them. Most important is the bicolon, and that is the most common in chapter 13. I'm not sure if there's even anything other than bicolons in chapter 13. So with the bicolon, and with other types, but with the bicolon especially, there are some very specific patterns that go along with this. So there are three basic types of bicolon patterns, according to our commentary. There is parallelism, progression, and proverbial merismus, as what it's called. And these also correspond to other labels, such as synonymous parallelism, and then you have synthetic parallelism, and finally antithetical parallelism. We'll explain those pretty quickly. But synonymous parallelism is basically when you have two lines that pretty much say the same thing, just in a different way. So they're synonymous in that way. That's synonymous parallelism. And our commentary just calls that as parallelism. There's regular parallelism or true parallelism. And then we have the synthetic parallelism, or progression, as you could call it. And, that's a very good descriptive word because the first line gives you a statement. And then the second line progresses on that statement. It goes further than that statement. It might elaborate more, might go further than that. So that's what we call synthetic parallelism. Finally, you have antithetical parallelism. And you can kind of remember it as okay, so they're kind of opposed to each other. They're making some kind of contrast here. And our commentary calls this proverbial merismus, but that's pretty confusing. The other one's confusing too, but I'll probably just call it antithetical parallelism. So you have two lines, usually, and the first line is contrasted with the second line. I know that's probably very confusing, but hopefully it's making some sense. I'll just repeat that. Synonymous parallelism, the first one, you have two basically the same statements. You're just saying the same thing in different ways. Synthetic parallelism is where the second line goes further than the first line. It progresses the idea. And proverbial merismus, or antithetical parallelism, is where you have contrast between the first and the second lines. That's all you need to know for that. Any questions on the patterns there? While you're thinking of questions, I'll just type these down for you.
Makes sense to me because, we see a lot of those play on words. We see some of that in the Psalms, but a lot of it in Proverbs, where it's like it'll say something, then it'll reiterate it by saying the opposite, and it'll say something, and then it'll say the opposite. So I always caught on with that kind of play on words.
Okay. Matt's just, I already got all this stuff in my head, just like last week. I already know all this stuff. So I wrote it down for you guys, and I gave you a one-word description of them. Synonymous parallelism, similar lines. Synthetic parallelism, you have progression. Antithetical parallelism, you have contrast. So hopefully that just kind of boils it down into something that you can remember very easily, because we'll be using those terms a little bit as we go along. That said, now that we've looked at the patterns, we're also going to look at one more thing, which are the collections. So in Proverbs, not only do you have these specific little patterns going through where you have, okay, here's a bicolon, that's 2 lines. Here's a tricolon, or 3 lines. You also have collections of those bicolons and tricolons, or monocolons, depending on what you have. You have these collections. So you have little tiny groups within larger groups. Hopefully, this will make more sense as we get along. But we have basically 5 major collections in the book of Proverbs. And let me just paste the commentary for you, because this has a lot of good information. Oh, hey NASCAR. I'm doing well. Hope you are too. Right now we're looking at collections in Proverbs. So if you have a question, just save it to the end of this part.
No, I was just wondering if you could hear me, man.
Oh, gotcha. Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah, because I was wondering if I'm using my AirPods.
Gotcha. Okay, so we looked at some patterns. Those are the smaller structures. Bicolons, tricolons, those are small. Now we're looking at collections. These are the larger structures. So looking at our commentary, I sent you the screenshot there. Number 1, you have a parallel collection. And these are proverbs grouped in an A-B-A-B pattern. We alluded to this a little bit last week, just to introduce this kind of thing to you. So A-B-A-B, and those letters stand for different lines or concepts especially. So if you're familiar with poetry, this will make a lot of sense, because you'll see a lot of that A-B-A-B and C-D and so on in poetry. But you have one concept represented by the letter A, then you have a different concept represented by the letter B, and then you go back to the same A concept, and then back to the B concept in that A-B-A-B pattern. And that is a parallel collection. Then we have number 2, a chiastic collection. And we also looked at this last week a little bit, but instead of an A-B-A-B pattern, we have a reversed order in A-B-B-A. So instead of the same pattern, A-B, and then A-B again, you have A-B reversed B-A. That's a chiasm. Number 3, a catchword collection. It's a group of proverbs that contain a common catchword. Some specific word or phrase is repeated that signals that the verses are related to one another. And number 4, you have a thematic collection, which is a group of proverbs that maintain a common theme. They deal with the same subject matter, same concept, same idea. Number 5, Inclusio collection. This is another one we looked at last week. It's a group of proverbs between an inclusio. And an inclusio is just a bookend, just a couple bookends where you have the section starting with a specific word or phrase, and then you have the section ending with that same specific word or phrase or the same idea. And we looked at that last week. And today, in Proverbs 13, we have all of these collections present. So it provides a very good study for us. So any questions on the different collections that you find in Proverbs? I will assume no questions. That's fine. If one does pop up, just let me know. So first we started off with the patterns of Proverbs. This also applies to a lot of wisdom literature and the Psalms and Hebrew poetry in general. You have monocolons, you have bicolons, and tricolons. And then we looked at the larger structures, which are the collections. And these collections can include bicolons, and will include bicolons in chapter 13. Most of the collections, I'm not sure what you mean by that exactly, but wherever you look at wisdom literature, poetry especially, you'll see these collections here and there. And Proverbs is basically built off of these collections, especially when we're looking at chapters 10 to 24. We'll see these things. And right now we're going to look at these things. So let's go ahead and jump into Proverbs 13 with all this kind of structure in mind. You can start looking for these things now. So if you do have the commentary, don't look at what Dwayne Garrett says these collections are just yet. I want you guys to kind of see them for yourself a little bit. Just kind of start. So if you want to read, please react to the Bible study react message. I'll pop it right here. You gotta have a microphone, of course. But if you want to be called on to read, just react to that message. There's going to be a lot of short readings. So hopefully we get a bunch of people reacting to that. Dogman has already done so. So Dogman, could you please read verses 1 to 4 of chapter 13?
Sure. I'm reading from the hold on. I'll do an NASB 1995. All right. A wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. From the fruit of a man's mouth he enjoys good, but the desire of the treacherous is violence. The one who guards his mouth preserves his life. The one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the soul of the diligent is made fat.
Perfect. So that's the first section, and just to give you a hint, this is the first collection as well. So if you don't have it open up, just open it up in front of you, either your Bible or in the chat, these first 4 verses, and take a look at them. And I want you to look at it for a couple minutes. It's a tough one, but what kind of collection is this out of the 5 that we have? So it looks like Dogman is proposing that perhaps it's a parallel collection. Maybe we see that kind of AB pattern here.
Which chapter are we in again? I have to look at it to see.
Chapter 13.
All right, thank you.
And suggest perhaps there's a theme about speaking here. It's another option.
Wasn't Solomon like? Because I noticed how he said like how you need to guard your mouth. Is that what it said?
There's probably psalms like that. Looking at Proverbs, though.
I was wondering. I was just wondering if Solomon was the first to say that and not Paul, because I think it was Paul who said guard your mouth in the New Testament.
That's possible.
All right.
So yeah, as Dogman says, okay, we see, some of these words being repeated here and there, at least the themes. We see mouths here, lips, speaking. Bombino suggests perhaps it's a catchword. Yes, yes, Bombino. So that is what our commentary says it is, and I also agree with that. So we're looking at a catchword collection, which is very similar to a thematic collection too. The only difference is that a catchword collection uses the same word usually, or phrase, and a thematic collection just uses the same concept, not necessarily the same exact word here and there. But also, we'll see that Dogman is also probably correct when he says a parallel collection. So it could be both. It could be 2 at the same time, which is why this is a tricky one. Thankfully, I have prepared a Proverbs 13 diagram for us. This is not like the block grammatical diagrams we looked at when we were studying Philippians. This is actually a structural diagram that is based on the collections that we see. So go ahead and open that up, because it will help us all stay on the same page. And as you're opening that collection up, the translation I'm using for this is not a very popular one, but it's a good one. It's the Cjb Translation. And the Cjb is basically a Jewish-style translation of the Old and New Testaments. What I really like about the Cjb here, which stands for Complete Jewish Bible, is that it does poetry very well. So if you're a big fan of the Psalms and the Proverbs, I'd recommend getting a Cjb. It does that especially well with making sure that it gets the bicolons and colons correct. So that's what I would recommend. It's not a very literal translation though, so we do run into some difficulties, and it doesn't give you the collections either, which is another issue. It just put all of these different verses in separated paragraphs. So I moved the paragraphs around to create this image. So just some background on the image. So anyway, verses 1 to 4, we have a catchword collection. And you'll see I have underlined some different words there. And they're color-coded as well. So let's look at the orange underlines. A son who heeds discipline, and discipline is also rendered as instruction or teaching. So listening and talking here. The son is listening, the father is talking. But a scoffer, that's someone who talks. He doesn't listen to rebuke, so he doesn't hear that. So hearing and talking. And verse 2 of what he says, that's talking again. Verse 3, he who guards his mouth has to do with talking, but one who talks too much. And I probably should have underlined mouth in blue there. But anyway, to the green underline, a man who enjoys good, lazy person wants, and diligent get their desires filled. And this has to do, in this context, we'll see later on, we're talking about desires and satisfaction of the stomach and the mouth. In the blue there, but the essence. And number 4, this is where the CJB gets a little weird because it's not literal, it's not word for word. The lazy person and the diligent. And I underlined in blue there because this is the same word. This is nefesh, which can be translated as mouth, and it has some other translations as well. So the mouth of the lazy person wants but doesn't have. The mouth of the diligent gets their desires filled. But the mouth of the treacherous is violence. So this is the same word repeated over. And you can see that this is the catchword. It's mouth, nefesh. And all the other underlines are related to that catchword. You talk with your mouth. And you can guard your mouth. You can close up your mouth so that you can listen better. And your mouth can desire things. And it can also enjoy good things, as verse 2 says. So that's why we're classifying this as a catchword category, catchword collection. But also, as Dogman suggested, which was very good, he also said perhaps we're talking about an AB parallel. And if you look closely at my underlines, you'll see that I have orange underlines in verses 1 and 3, and green and blue underlines in verses 2 and 4. So what kind of pattern does that make? Well, we see A, orange, B, green, blue, and then A, orange again, and then B, green, blue. So hopefully things are starting to make sense now that we're actually applying some of what we learned at the very beginning. We can see those colons, all those single lines there. And if you see that slight indentation, sometimes I kind of remove the indentation later on, but the slight indentations tell you that we're looking at a bicolon. The punctuation tells you that too. So we have 4 bicolons here. So blue means mouth. It means nefesh. I know that's confusing. The translation doesn't bring that out well. Most translations don't, because it would be a little confusing. But if you were looking at the Hebrew, you'd see that same word in the blue underlines there. And some translations do say mouth, which helps a lot more than what we're seeing here. So some knowledge of Hebrew will help you build these structures. And even if you don't have much knowledge of Hebrew, just having some Bible software, Logos, or just an interlinear, so you can see, oh, I see the same Hebrew word here that I do here, even if you can't read the Hebrew word. It will help a little bit. It'll take some time to study though, but it's there. So any questions on verses 1 to 4? We're going to be focusing on structure today, but we'll get into a little bit of meaning and interpretation too.
I had a quick question. So do we see this format in like other chapters of the Bible as well? Like do these formats get repeated as well? Or is it just specifically in Psalms and Proverbs?
You'll see this pretty much throughout Scripture. A chiasm especially is one of the most popular things that you might see. You'll see chiasms in epistles as well. You'll see chiasms in Paul's writings. You'll see them in the Gospels, and definitely Psalms, of course, big chiasm place, and elsewhere. So they're there. Even if it's not like a specifically, here's a poem, here's poetry, here's wisdom literature section, you will still see that, even in general discourse. The chiasm is basically there to help you remember the words. We'll get into a chiasm later on in chapter 13 too.
All right. Cool.
See some people typing over there. Oh, are you just kidding? Oh, no. Okay, I get it. That was a good one, Dogman. Yeah, that's pretty much how you would transliterate it. Let me see if I can grab it for you. This is from Mounce's Hebrew dictionary there, nefesh. You could also say, most people transliterate it with a PH, like you did, just so that you can get the sound better. And they also say SH. If you want to be fancy though, you put the little marker above the S to tell you that it's an SH sound. And this is from the ESV, but all of the highlights there is that word nefesh. So ESV says desire instead of mouth, and it says preserves his life instead of mouth, which makes more sense, right? You won't say, whoever guards his mouth preserves his mouth. Two different words there. It makes little sense that way, but it obscures the catchword. Yeah, so in Hebrew, nefesh is usually translated as mouth, but it can also mean different things. So under the other screenshot I sent from Mounce's dictionary, it can mean breath or life, force, soul, the immaterial part of a person, the seat of emotion or desire, a creature or person as a whole, self, body, even corpse. So the way I can tell that mouths in verse 4, just nefesh, not necessarily a mouth, are lazy, diligent, is because there are actually two different words there. One is the word nefesh, and another is the adjective, lazy or diligent. But the CJB gives you a one-word answer. It says diligent instead of the soul of the diligent, or the nefesh of the diligent, which is an issue that you'll run into with non-word-for-word translations. Makes it difficult to study. But I'm just using the CJB because it does preserve the poetry a little better than most translations. So yeah, it takes a good bit of study. So let's get to the next section, verses 5 to 6. Let's see if anyone else reacted. Okay, Bombino, could you read verses 5 and 6?
Good thing. I'm reading this from the New King James Version. So, a righteous man hates lying, but a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. Righteousness guards him whose way is blameless, but wickedness overthrows the sinner.
Wonderful. We'll go through this a little more quickly now. You can see this is an easier one to categorize. I have those little underlines there. We have a righteous person. We're talking about that. And then we switch topics. We're on topic B now, talking about the wicked person. And then we go back to the righteous person, topic A, and then topic B. So that's a parallel collection, A, B, A, B. You can see that through the colors of the underlines there. This also might be a catchword collection, at least according to Dwayne Garrett. It could be. It's a little tough to say that, but we do see kind of a catchword going on here. It's a short section, so it's kind of hard to judge, but we see righteousness, wickedness. Yeah, that kind of sounds like a catchword. So that's how we would categorize that. And just some more on that. The reason why we're looking at collections here, it's not just to be fancy. It's not just to go, oh look, I know all these big words now, and we can all strut around with our chests puffed up and things like that. Oh no, don't do that. But the main purpose of this is to get a better understanding of the context and to better interpret these verses. So if we're taking 5 and 6 as a collection, it kind of stands by itself, and every single proverb can stand by itself, but they also gain some more meaning when you put them into their proper collections. So verses 5 and 6. So if we're looking at just verse 6, for example, righteousness protects him whose way is honest, but wickedness brings down the sinner. You can go, okay, that's fine, and understand it that way, just as it says when you're looking at that one verse. But as our commentary says, by itself, verse 6 is a rather colorless proverb. In context with verse 5, however, It implies that disregard for truth and the spreading of scandal is ultimately self-destructive. Those who care about the truth, however, are preserved by their integrity. And the reason he can say that, even though verse 6 doesn't say anything about spreading lies, getting into scandal, lying to people, or anything like that, it just talks about destruction, brings down the sinner. It doesn't talk about lying, though. But verse 5 does talk about lying. And we know that this is a collection in parallel, A, B, A, B. So if we put verse 6 in context with verse 5, you see that a righteous person hates lying, and so righteousness protects him whose way is honest. And the end of verse 5, but the wicked is vile and disgraceful, and wickedness brings down the sinner. Okay, what kind of wickedness are we talking about? If you're looking at just verse 6, well, you're talking about vileness and disgrace. And not only that, but this vileness and disgracefulness is in contrast. Well, not really full contrast, but it's also opposed to the first part of verse 5, hating lying. So we get this broader picture now. Well, we're not talking just about some kind of general ambiguous wickedness in verse 6 that brings down the sinner. No, we're talking about lying. We're talking about being vile. We're talking about being disgraceful. That's what wickedness brings down the sinner. That's the kind of wickedness that we're talking about in context. So hopefully that's starting to make sense. Now that we've brought out the collections, we've set these verses together, we know the context of these verses now, we can also use that context to help us interpret these passages. That's the whole goal of all of this. So, any questions on verses 5 and 6? I will assume no questions. I have one for you though. Is this helpful? Is this helping you understand Proverbs a little better?
I think that generally grammar, and like I was trying to study grammar and hermeneutics, and it kind of just started to go over my head. Just so it's not really a topic that I'm really good at, to be fair. Like, I can recognize it. I don't know any of the words or what it even means. I know what it implies. Like if you're, for example, in a sentence saying, here's one thing, and then you flip the sentence and say the opposite, you're giving contrast. And I can identify that, but grammar's not really my forte or speciality.
Well, that's good, because we're not learning about grammar. This would
but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I get what you mean. But yeah, this would be classified as structure or rhetoric, depending on how specific you get. But, that's all built on grammar, too. So I get what you mean. I'm glad it's helpful to you guys. And I really hope that it's starting to make sense. I know it was probably confusing at the beginning, but hopefully as we keep applying these things, it'll make more and more sense. All right, we'll get into the next section. You guys can keep writing your comments if you want. But if you want to be called on to read, hopefully we get more volunteers. Just react to the little message in the Bible Study React channel. But Dogman, could you please read verses 7 to 11?
All right. I'm reading from the CJB, from the diagram. There are those with nothing who pretend they are rich, are also those with great wealth who pretend they are poor. The rich man may have to ransom his life, but a poor man gets no threats. The light of the righteous shines joyfully, but the lamp of the wicked will be extinguished. Insolence produces only strife, but wisdom is found with those who take advice. Wealth gotten by worthless means dwindles away, but he who amasses it by hard work will increase it.
Perfect, thanks. So, going quickly again, you could probably already see this yourself very easily. This was probably the one we should have started with. The first one was a little tougher, but we see that's a thematic collection, right? And question to you guys, what's the theme Quick answer. What's the theme? Wealth. Yes, we're talking about wealth throughout this whole section. Now you might be wondering, okay, I see the theme of wealth in verses 7, 8, and 11. What about 9 and 10? I don't see wealth mentioned anywhere there. So why is it included in this whole section? Perhaps we could say verses 7 and 8 are thematic collection about wealth, and then we can split off verses 9 and 10 about that. And you know, that's a possibility, and that's why we got to be careful when we are creating these collections, because you could be wrong. Solomon doesn't go out and say, this is a thematic collection that I'm going to write to you right now in this section, verses 7 to 11. He doesn't say that. So you got to be a little careful. But the reason we include 9 and 10 is because verse 11 talks about wealth. And that's after 9 and 10. So it kind of, you just take it as a whole, it includes verses 9 and 10. So that's why we include it all as one little section. But yeah, we're also talking about riches here. We're talking about the poor in contrast to that. So that's what we're looking at in this section. And just a couple different notes. In verse 7, we haven't learned all the different types of proverbs specifically, but verse 7 is what you would call an observational proverb. This is just giving you an observation about how the world works. It's not giving you an explicit moral duty or obligation. It just says there are those with nothing who pretend they are rich, also those with great wealth who pretend they're poor. It just gives you an observation of what's going on. It doesn't tell you, do this, don't do that. But that could be implicitly implied there. So that's what an observational proverb is. Maybe next week we'll look at the specific kinds of proverbs, different forms they can kind of take. I just want to quickly introduce that to you very briefly. And according to our commentary, he says that, perhaps more profoundly, instead of just looking at, okay, some people deceitfully pretend they're poor or rich. More profoundly, though, things are not always what they seem. So you could take it a little further if you want to and go for a more general principle. So the principle right there is that, people pretend about their wealth sometimes. And the more general principle is that things are not always what they seem. People can pretend about a lot of things. So you could take that further if you'd like. And commenting on verse 8. Verse 8. What do you guys think of verse 8 means? The ransom of a man's life is his wealth, but a poor man hears no threat. What does that mean?
Well, obviously, like the direct meaning is, if you're rich, you can buy yourself out of jail. You can, ransom your life if you're blackmailed or whatever. But if you're poor, you don't have those kind of threats or danger in the first place.
Yeah, no one wants your money because you don't have any money.
Yeah.
A robber walks into your house. There's nothing to steal here. You got nothing. So yeah, that's what I would say that would mean. And, the rich man, his wealth can be a prison. So riches are not always a good thing in Proverbs. Some verses, especially the observational ones, where the one proverb says that the rich man's wealth is his fortress or his city. It's kind of looked on a little positively, but it's not always positive. Because now people are trying to get money from this rich man, but they don't really care about the poor man. He gets no threats. All right, verses 9 and 10 now. So our commentary says that, okay, verses 9 and 10, even though they don't have to do with riches, what do they mean in the context of a collection about wealth? He says that they may have been placed in this context to draw the reader to reflect that true wealth consists of a pure life and a patient spirit, which is what verses 9 and 10 talk about. So the other passages, we're talking more about wealth itself. And verses 9 and 10, we get a kind of moral twist to this whole collection. By implication, the arrogant rich only appear to be wealthy, their lives are filled with strife, and their light is quickly extinguished. And I also wanted to point out verse 10 real quick. By insolence comes nothing but strife, but with those who take advice is wisdom. And insolence is basically arrogance, it's pride, and arrogant people can produce strife. I've seen people like that in our server. They walk in, they usually have a theological bone to pick with people. They got this one single idea that they're obsessed with, and they need everyone to agree with them, and if they don't agree, well, you're a heretic, you're a nerd, get out of here. And they keep producing strife because of their arrogance. And you might see the moderators on the server here and there talk to these people, hey, you gotta calm down a little bit, and then they just flip out even more. Who are you to tell me what to do? So I just wanted to point that out because it's a very relatable verse to me as far as being a moderator goes. It hits close to home with people running around producing strife because of arrogance. But anything that you guys had as far as thoughts go on this section?
Oh, more so probably just a question because, it really does seem to switch topics when it's talking about, money, riches, and righteousness. Well, wait, never mind. Okay, verse 6 talks about righteousness guards the way of the integrity. Well, integrity, right, okay. I'm just curious as to, with the general theme being about money, why it would just kind of switch over to the light of the righteous shines brightly, but the lamp of the wicked is snuffed out. What do you think that light is talking about in context? Is that the light of their existence? Being snuffed out is you have no food, you're dead? Or is it, talking about something else, you think?
That's a great question. And the Hebrew word itself doesn't really help us too much. Can just mean light. But according to Mounce's Hebrew dictionary, by extension, if we take this figuratively, which is how you should take it in this context, not talking about their literal light, whatever that is, but if you take it figuratively, you could say positive, happy attitude resulting from relief from trouble. So, you could talk about joy or happiness.
I also had a quick question about the interpretation of this verse. So, when we talk about wealth in this particular verse, could it also be interpreted as something like not just material wealth, but the thought that you may know more than someone else? Just like I don't know how to explain it. Just like thinking you know more than others, I guess, in a sense.
Well, that's a possibility, especially since we're talking about arrogance in verse 10. And, arrogance can stem from thinking that you know a lot more than people, and you might. Arrogance can stem from that. But I would say if we're going to make that connection, I think we should broaden it out a little bit and say perhaps we're talking about wealth as virtue and moral excellence as an option. And that's pretty much how our commentary takes it in light of verses 9 and 10 being included with all of this, because verses 9 and 10 is about virtue.
Okay. Just wanted to get another take on that. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, let's get to the next collection. No one else has volunteered yet to read. So Bombino, can you read verses 12 to 19?
All right, sure thing. So, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. He who despises the word will be destroyed, but he who fears the commandment will be rewarded. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to turn one away from the snares of death. Good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. Every prudent man acts with knowledge, but a fool lays open his folly. A wicked messenger falls into trouble, but a faithful ambassador brings health. Poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards a rebuke will be honored. A desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but it is an abomination to fools to depart from evil.
Wonderful. Thanks. We're going to get through the next collections fairly quickly now. So this one's an inclusio. And if you remember, an inclusio is where you have the same or very similar word or phrase at the beginning of a section and at the end of a section. So as we're looking at this, what is that repeated word or phrase? What do you guys think to make this an inclusio? Yeah, desire. And you actually really got very close there. Like, you hit the nail on the head, really, because the Hebrew word fulfilled, that's translated fulfilled here, is slightly different. But the word desire is the exact same in the Hebrew. But the fulfilled word is just similar. But yeah, you got it right there. You could also say desire fulfilled. You know, that's close enough to call this an inclusio. And because we have an inclusio starting at the first section, and we have the same word or phrase at the end of the section, we know that this is all part of one collection. You'll notice, though, that desire fulfilled starts in the second line of verse 12 and not the first line. What about that? Well, should we cut off the first line and say that's not part of the inclusio? No, because we're talking about a bicolon in verse 12. So because it's all one little pattern section, we have to take it as its whole, even though the inclusio starts in the second line. So that's why we include the entire bicolon, entire verse 12 there. So hopefully you can start seeing these things. We're going to get through all the collections, and in your own readings, look for these inclusios. Oh, that's an interesting kind of thing. He talks about the same exact word or phrase. Even Paul uses inclusios in his letters. So this is not just applicable to Psalms and Proverbs. You can use this stuff anywhere. But you also see that I have this indented quite a bit. That's not part of the inclusio. This is actually a chiasm pattern. So you have A, B, and chiasms can differ. It's not just A, B, B, A. That's the only chiasm you can have. And you can have different chiasms. So that's what we have here. It's a unique one. A, B, C, C, D, D, and then we reverse the order B, A. So just bear that in mind. The first part, the A section, and this helps a lot when we're looking at chiasms. So we see A and then A prime at the end there. And that's an A with a little single quote after it. Just poetry terminology, A prime. So verse number A, letter A, that says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And if we look at the second line, but desire fulfilled is a tree of life. Okay, that's A. What about A prime? Desire fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but turning away from evil is abhorrent to fools. So we're talking about the same thing here. That's why we say A and A prime, or just A again, if it's just exact same. And then we have B and B prime. So you can see the line that I have drawn before those. And reading B, he who despises a word will suffer for it, but he who respects a command will be rewarded. And B prime, poverty and shame are for him who won't be taught, but he who heeds reproof will be honored. Okay, so we're talking about, teaching here, listening to people. B says this person is despising a word. He doesn't take the word, but, the other person respects a command. And then B prime is talking about someone who won't be taught and someone who heeds reproof, someone who listens. So they're talking about very similar things there. And that's why we say B and B prime. The same holds true for C and C prime and D prime. That's how chiasms work. Any questions on this section so far? All right, I'll assume no questions. Good, because we got to keep going. All right, someone new has reacted. Cheryl, could you please read verses 20 to 21?
20. Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Disasters pursue sinners, but the righteous are rewarded with good.
Wonderful. So that's verses 20 to 21. We're talking about a chiasm here. He who walks with the wise will become wise. That's letter A. But the companion of fools will suffer. That's letter B. Verse 21. Evil pursues sinners. That's B prime. But prosperity will reward the righteous. That's A prime. So hopefully you can see that pattern there. So A, talking about wise. And then we switch topics a little bit. And we talk about B, companion of fools. And evil pursues sinners. Well, we're still talking about fools, wicked people. And then A prime, prosperity will reward the righteous. Back to all of that. And you'll notice that A prime does not say anything about wisdom. But in the chiastic form, we know that these are related. So he who walks with the wise will become wise, but prosperity will reward the righteous. In other words, he's making that connection between righteous and wise. And the same connection in B and B prime, talking about fools and evil and sinners. So hopefully you can see all those connections there. Let's keep going. Last collection. And we'll go with Bombino again. Can you please read that last collection, verses 22 to 25? Maybe Bombino had to step out for a drink of water or something. Oh, he's back.
Yeah, sorry. What verses was I reading?
22
Apologies.
to 25.
Okay. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. Much food is in the fallow ground of the poor, and for lack of justice there is waste. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. The righteous eats to the satisfying of his soul, but the stomach of the wicked shall be in want.
Wonderful. So we have another parallel collection here. You have AB, AB, and we're talking about 4 bicolons. That's why we have AB, AB, not AB, 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 and so on. But just 4 bicolons in a parallel kind of structure. So, what does this mean? We looked a little bit about what a chiasm kind of meant and how those connections were made in an ABBA pattern. What about an ABAB pattern? Well, we go ahead and look at this. We have A and then B, which tells us that we switch topics a little bit. But let's look at A and A. So that's verses 22 and 24. They're parallel with each other. A good man leaves an inheritance to his grandchildren, but the wealth of a sinner is stored up for the righteous. In verse 24, he who fails to use a stick hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. So there, in parallel collections, there should be a common theme between the two of the same letter. What is common between verses 22 and 24? What do you guys think?
Probably relation to children, since 22 says a good man leaves an inheritance for his grandchildren. And 24 says he who fails to use a stick hates his son. I'm reading from your notes. But yeah, so it's talking about children in both instances, and in the context of righteousness, and the topic of a righteous person's children.
Yeah, we're talking about children, and along with that, as Bombino said, we're talking about a father figure in both of these things. Anything else, though? We looked at some of the characters that are present in both sections, but excluding characters, what do we see?
I noticed that they also mentioned wealth again. I don't know if that has any relation, but I remember seeing wealth in an earlier proverb.
Yeah,
but I'm not entirely sure.
Wealth definitely is a part of this. So we see a father helping out his son. His grandchildren in this case, a good man. But we're leaving something for these grandchildren. We're leaving an inheritance. And the second line of verse 22, but the wealth of a sinner is stored up for the righteous. That is something left for the righteous people. And in verse 24, we see the father figure. He who fails to use a stick hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. The father is leaving something for that son. And in essence, you could basically, well, as our commentary does, in essence, he looks at the principle at play here. So verse 22, you have a material inheritance. And in verse 24, you have a moral inheritance. So verse 22, the good man is leaving an inheritance for his grandchildren. We can assume that's material, at least in just verse 22 context. But the wealth of a sinner is stored up for the righteous. That's leaving a material inheritance for them. And verse 24, what do fathers do for their children? Well, they leave them things. And in this case, he's leaving a moral inheritance for his son. So that's the connection there, inheritance, along with everything else you guys mentioned, which was good. But yeah, verse 23 and 25, what's the connection here? The fields of the poor may yield much food, some are swept away because of injustice. The righteous person eats his fill, but the belly of the wicked is empty. What's the connection? How are these parallel?
Hunger, no?
Yeah. Hunger. That's definitely something present in verses 23 and 25. And then our commentary takes it a little further. A little interesting, I thought. So in verse 23, we're talking about hunger because of injustice. May yield much food, but some are swept away because of injustice. But in verse 25, there's a different reason for this kind of hunger. The righteous person eats his fill, but the belly of the wicked is empty. So now we're talking about a kind of moral hunger, or even a divine hunger. So the first one is because of injustice. That wasn't the poor person's fault or anything like that. They're just bad people running around in a bad society, maybe stealing the food, trampling the crops, burning the grain stores or whatever, destroying stuff because of injustice. It wasn't the poor person's fault. But in verse 25, we do see that the belly of the wicked is empty. That's his fault because he's been wicked. So this leads us a little bit to one question I had. I was going to bring out to you guys, but I kind of forgot. But verse 21, on our kind of theme of, is the prosperity gospel found in Proverbs? Evil pursues sinners, but prosperity will reward the righteous. Can I just take this and run and say, well, I'm going to live a perfect life now, have no problems or troubles at all? No, and the answer is no, as most of you would say. And we can easily see that in the very next collection, where we don't hear anything about these poor people, no moral judgment on them, but injustice outside of them has taken away their food. And that's an issue. But it's not because they were being bad, or because they weren't righteous, or anything like that. Any final thoughts or questions that you guys had on anything in chapter 13? Or anything on the structure of the collections, or the colons, anything like that?
Well, is there any like super simple way to find these? Because sometimes I could read something and I could miss it. So you're not just looking at the English grammar, you're looking at the Hebrew grammar, or sorry, the Hebrew words to be able to get these, because one time it'll say desire and that's one word, another time it'll say the word desire and that'll be another word, and it'll completely depend also on the translation that you're using.
Yep.
Which word comes out. So is there any simple way to being able to find these in a way that would actually be practical and helpful to the average Joe here, like myself, who kind of can't grasp it just because it's big.
Now, that's an excellent question. And I have a few resources I could recommend. Number one would be the commentary. That would be the easiest thing. So the commentary we've been using so far has been Dwayne Garrett's New American Commentary on Proverbs, which also includes Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. You can purchase that if you'd like. We can also help you get access to that if you send me a direct message. And we already have some commentary groups who are going through this. So that would be number one, because he points all this out. He gives you the collections, and then you can look at the passage and see if he got that right. Because sometimes he might, well, he's not infallible. He could get the collections wrong. But it'll help you immediately see all of that and test if that's true. And he'll give you reasons for these collections as well. He'll say, well, I see this word repeated here, here, and here. Or I see this theme repeated here, here, and here. And he'll point that out. So that's the easiest way, I would say. But, that can cost money. You're buying a commentary. It's a worthy investment, though. Don't get me wrong. You should be buying commentaries. They're good stuff. Another couple resources I would recommend would be an interlinear or a reverse interlinear Bible. You can see those online. Bible Hub's got one. Blue Letter Bible probably has one. You can see those online where you can see different Greek and Hebrew. Now that can be difficult though, because you won't, unless you know a little bit of Greek and Hebrew, you won't be able to read those words. You just kind of see, okay, these are the same characters that I see here and here and here. So it's a little more difficult. Transliterations will help you. Usually interlinears will have those, the English form of those, that pronunciation. That'll help you a little bit. But it's also difficult because sometimes, a lot of the times, there's morphology. And morphology is when you have a basic word that changes form a little bit to refer to something else slightly. But you're talking about the same thing. You're talking about the same definition, the same word that you'll see in a dictionary form, but it'll be slightly different to refer to something else. So you could talk about, for instance, I'll just give you an English example. You have prince. That's what you'd see in the dictionary. And then you have princes, talking about a plural of princes. And if you weren't familiar with a language, you might think that those were two separate, completely different words that mean something completely different. But really, the word just morphed so that you could talk about singular prince and multiple princes. You could also morph it into princess or princesses. You might not get that the author is trying to make a connection there if the word has been morphed a little bit. Anyway, let me tell you of one more resource that I can think of off the top of my head, and that would be Logos Bible software. So there's a very handy feature that I use all the time, and you can use this in the English translations as well. So if you look at the screenshot, it has highlighted the desire, life, soul, and the soul. It's highlighted all of those words there, and that's because I have it set up so that if I click any word in an English translation, it will then highlight where that same Hebrew or Greek word is found elsewhere in the passage that I'm looking at. And that's very easy to set up. If I can see if I can find it here. Not sure if I can find it right off the spot, but okay, there it is. So under visual filters, you'll see this kind of menu right there. You'll see that menu. I hit visual filters and it gives me corresponding words, and I have that check marked. Hover or click, and when I click a word, it'll give me the same word in the Hebrew or Greek and the same lemma. And a lemma is a dictionary form. They call them lexical forms of a word. So that'll give me all the instances of where I can find that same word. So that's also how I figured out that when we were looking at the Inclusio, when we were talking about desire fulfilled, that we're looking at different words there. Desire is the same word, but fulfilled, even though it's translated the same, fulfilled, it's actually a different Hebrew word there. And when you hover over words in Logos, you see in the bottom left-hand corner the Hebrew lemma of whatever word you're hovered over. So that's what I use. That's where I would recommend you use. The commentary will help a lot, but Logos Bible software or some other Bible software will help you outside of Proverbs when you're looking for these things. So hopefully those resources help a little bit, and I'd recommend you guys check them out. Start checking them out and checking them out.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'm trying to think of if there's anything else I want to recommend, but if I do, I will let you guys know. That's all I can think of.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, Dogman, we're back to you, because no one else reacted. Could you please close us out with a word of prayer?
Sure. God, thank you for everything you do. Thank you for your word today, your word being available. Thank you for the Bible study today. Please help us this week to not be like the foolish man and to be like the wise man. Help us learn what wisdom you want us to learn. Help us be with us throughout the week. Help us to love you more. In Jesus' name I pray.
Amen.